Good morning or afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for taking the time to join us today via webinar. My name is Amelia Shaw. I am AgForce's Policy Officer for Transport. I'm also joined today by Zach Whale, who also is one of AgForce's policy staff members looking after grains policy. Thank you very much once again for joining. Today's seminar and webinar will be available online afterwards. If you're having any technical issues, please call 1300 733 416. I'll pop that down the chat box just in case you have issues throughout the presentation. If you have connection issues, reloading may be your best option to start off with, so please check the red cross in the top right-hand corner. As I mentioned, there will be a recording of this presentation made available at the end. If you have any questions to ask throughout the presentation, you'll notice that there is a chat function on the left-hand side of your screen. Feel free to answer those questions, write your questions down there, and time permitting, we will get to these at the end of the presentation. As you're well aware, today's webinar is about chain of responsibility laws, which are coming into effect on the 1st of October. We're keen to ensure that AgForce members are aware of their responsibilities, and hence the purpose of today's webinar. And we are joined by the National Heavy Vehicle Regulator in ensuring that you're well aware of what today's proceedings are about. So we have Steve, who is a policy advisor for the Regulatory Compliance Division of NHVR. Zach will be also facilitating this conversation throughout today, so I'll hand over to Zach.
Thank you, Amelia. Thank you, everybody. So Steve's going to run through some key things about chain of responsibility now, and I guess outline the key changes and what's new and what's happening, and then probably most importantly, we'll talk about some of the myths that are out there and start to discuss those and what's actually required, and I guess what people will be thinking about is how you can comply with these new laws. So Steve, do you want to kick us off and just sort of give a lay of the land and run through a few slides outlining chain of responsibility? And I guess importantly, helping people understand that it's not all new and that they don't need to necessarily really freak out because on the 1st of October, everything's not necessarily changing.
No, you're right, Zach. Yeah, our purpose today is to promote the awareness of the law changes and help farmers understand what's coming. And there's three important takeaways today that I'd like people to take away, and that's sort of to make sure they know when the changes are coming, what those changes are, and also dispel the myths that are floating around out there and in the industry. My goal today is not to tell people how to run their business, but simplify what needs to be known so they can comfortably go about their business and communicate in their part of the supply chain with what's required. So the idea behind COR is that you're only responsible for those things that you can control or influence if you're a party in the chain in relation to transport activities, whether that's a consigner, a prime contractor, operator, scheduler, a consignee, or an unloader, or a loader, or a loading manager. Importantly, an employed driver is not necessarily a party in the chain. However, a driver who's also an operator, etc., as an example, which might be the case if you were a farmer, you would have those responsibilities as a party in the chain.
And I guess, Steve, one of the interesting things from the agricultural perspective is often a farmer or a primary producer is almost all parties or many parties under the chain at the one time. So they're possibly the loader, the unloader, the consigner, and often even the driver.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Zach. What's important to share is that you can, as one person, you can have more than one responsibility, and more than one person can have one responsibility or more responsibilities. But just on that, the focus is on transport activities, and it's probably an important definition to relay to your audience exactly what transport activities are. And under the Heavy Vehicle National Law, transport activities include the business practices and making decisions associated with heavy vehicle on a road. Okay, so it's contracting, directing, or employing a person to drive a vehicle or conduct other activities in relation to a heavy vehicle, like repairs or maintenance. consigning, scheduling, packing goods, managing the loads, or actually doing the loading or unloading, and of course receiving goods. And as you mentioned, farmers could be one of those or all of them at any one time. Just depends on the circumstance. You may have heard of the word positive duty, which basically means that the duty is the law before it changed used to relate to when an offence was detected. Then the chain of responsibility laws were enlivened. Okay, but the law's changing now in the 1st of October. And that means it doesn't necessarily need to be activated by an offence, say of mass or dimension or speeding, etc. It's a general primary duty that to make sure that safety is the priority and activities in relation to farming and transport distribution is done safely.
So just to make that crystal clear, so under the previous legislation, if an offence took place, say a truck rolled over and investigators and prosecutors started to look at that situation, they would work back to try to work out who may have had an impact on that happening, and in that instance, you could possibly have come under the chain and had some questions to answer. But only if an offence took place, whereas now you've actually got to do what's reasonable and practicable the whole time, irrespective of whether there's an offence or not.
Yes, that's correct, Zach. It goes back to 1995 when this sort of got into practice, and that's where all offences, or most of the offences in relation to heavy vehicles, were always attributed to the drivers. But in 1995, Queensland enacted some laws that held owners and any person exerting influence or control liable for offences in relation to just mass at the time. But by 1999, most of the states had enacted laws that extended to executive officers and agents and representatives of companies that influence freight activities. And the concept of chain of responsibility as we know it now came into being actually in 2008. So it's not entirely new, a lot of the things that are happening. And of course, as you would be aware, that in 2014 our organisation came into being, and on the 1st of October, the important date that we're talking about today, is when the most significant changes to the law have come into place. So as we've mentioned, what I'd like to reinforce, that it's important that primary producers play their part in supporting a safe and reliable transport industry, but it's only about what they can influence and control. So what the law looks like is probably simplified, is that it's aligned very closely with workplace health and safety laws that no doubt primary producers, farmers, etc. have some familiarity with, and it's not too different. So a lot of the things that have been done ordinarily in business now in relation to workplace health and safety can transfer over to those transport activities that we discussed before. Although the law changes, it still only impacts what you can influence and you can control. The parties are the same, and as we mentioned before, you can have one duty or you can have more than one duty, and more than one person can have responsibility of various roles under the party responsibility. But the obligation is that a primary producer does what he is reasonably able to do to ensure that the transport activities are conducted safely.
Can I just ask a follow-up point on that,
yeah.
Steve? I think sometimes when people think about these types of laws, they think that if you have a responsibility, that someone else doesn't. However, legislation like this that focuses on shared responsibility is actually multiple parties having responsibility, and just because, say, a farmer might have a responsibility doesn't mean that the transport company or the driver or other parties in the chain don't have a responsibility. They still have their responsibilities. It's just we all have a responsibility. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's the principle of these new laws is that it's a shared responsibility of safety. The primary duty of making sure that all of those activities associated with the transport of produce, etc., is done safely.
And I guess as a rule of thumb, and just to really hammer home the point about what's reasonably practicable, if you can't control or influence something that happens in the freight supply chain, I guess that's a good marker or a good indicator that you really probably don't have to do something in that space. If you can't control and influence something, then that's likely to be someone else's responsibility. However, if you can control and influence it, then the primary producer has to start thinking about what they might be able to do in that instance.
Well, that's exactly right, and I would suggest that if there's some doubt, consider it anyway. So far as reasonably practical has been established in the workplace health and safety legislation previously, and specifically the definitions in relation to a duty, something that was reasonably able to be done at the time, weighing up all the relevant matters. So it depends on the circumstances, and what might occur on one set of circumstances or one particular day might be different under a different lot of circumstances. There's 5 elements in relation to so far as reasonably practical, and they are the likelihood of the risk, the chance that this event might occur, the degree of harm that it could result in, what you knew about the risk, the knowledge of the risk, or what you should have known, and what ways there are to remove or remedy or minimise that risk. Another important element is the cost involved, and a lot of people ring up sometimes and say, oh, it's too expensive or something, or some other reason why they can't put these measures in place. Well, in an example where the risk is high and the danger is probably death or significant damage to infrastructure, if something was to go to court and there was a problem later on, the excuse that it was too expensive to implement some sort of remedy probably wouldn't help you at all, if you understand what I mean.
Yep.
So if it's low risk, low cost, it's something you need to do. If it's high risk, high cost, it's also something that unfortunately has to be measured and considered. So considering the cost of modifying your procedures is proportionate to the risk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, look, I think that brings us to a few myths or a few scenarios that are out there, and these are things that the ag sector has been grappling with for quite a few months now, and I should also say that there is some information on the NHVR's website that actually spells some of this out. But while we've got Steve here, I'd really like to explore some of the scenarios. So there's a grain grower scenario here that I'm going to ask you, Steve. So a farmer's silo's full. The farmer phones their transporter to empty it and transport the grain to market. It's a standing arrangement with the transporter who does the job when it's convenient to them. The farmer won't be there when the grain's loaded. Would something like this comply with the new COR laws?
Well, importantly, a farmer doesn't necessarily need to be there when his produce is being loaded. It's important that he makes sure that those goods that he's loading are available and they can be safely accessed. Perhaps ideally it might be a good idea to be there if you can and be involved and support the people that are transporting, but it's not a requirement that you be there, just as long as you make sure that they're accessible and it can be done safely and that you're across what's going on. So
in this scenario, what are the practical impacts for farmers?
Well, practically, if they operate in the same way in which they manage slips, trips and falls and things like that in relation to workplace health and safety, they're going to meet their obligations generally, I would suggest, with the changes in the law. The main focus for farmers is to make sure that their requests don't cause drivers to speed or skip rest breaks or load incorrectly, etc., and set realistic time frames. So practically, it involves communication and maybe a reconnection with the people that farmers are doing business with, just to touch base and ensure that there's an understanding that as a team that you're conducting those transport activities in accordance to the law and meeting your obligations.
Yep. So on this point, and it's certainly something that we've been speaking to the NHVR about, there's two distinct scenarios when farmers or primary producers are undertaking a transport task. Often they might have their own trucks, their own staff, and they might use those to undertake a transport task, and in another scenario they might fully outsource that transport task. So the level of responsibility a farmer or a primary producer is going to have for those two scenarios is significantly different, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. In the first portion of your description, that describes an actual party in the chain where they have the same responsibilities of, as other people further up the chain or bringing goods. But as if it's being outsourced and subcontractors, there's still likely to be perhaps a prime contractor. It's important still to be across the functions and the processes that the people that you're working with are involved in. It doesn't mean that you have to be an expert necessarily, but be across and understand the way that they're operating and be assured that it's done lawfully and safely. And that's how farmers will be doing business now. They pick the people that they do business with because they do it the right way, or it's legal, or it's appropriate, or it's done well. I mean, that's how they're probably already doing their business. So it's probably a little bit more now, a bit more formal. It's about replicating and sort of documenting sometimes some of the processes, and just so you can demonstrate this is how I do business. And perhaps when farmers are choosing who they do business with, one of the first questions they could ask is, okay, there's obligations as far as the Heavy Vehicle National Law is concerned. Can you tell me how you meet them? Demonstrate them to me and have that conversation, because communication's a big thing, and that's where it probably starts.
So one of the questions that or I guess one of the issues we regularly hear from our members, and especially those who are probably in more isolated parts of Queensland, around a lack of transport operators, and basically these really steep timeframes where you've got a lot of cattle that you need to get to market. You probably don't have a lot of choice in terms of who's going to undertake that freight task. So just an interesting scenario. The people you've got lined up to move your stock for whatever reason can't do it, and you're under time pressure and you engage a new transporter. What sort of questions would you ask, or what sort of process would you recommend a producer goes through to start to cover off on some of this sort of thing?
Well, I would suggest that initially, like I mentioned before, the first question is to share with the new operator you're considering to do business with that you have awareness of some obligations under the Heavy Vehicle National Law, and that you'd like them to share with how they're meeting them and what sort of processes that they have in place. And if you're comfortable that they're reputable and they're conducting the things that are required to move your produce safely, and you're satisfied reasonably by that, you're a long way to go to meeting your obligations. However, if an operator didn't have any practices, didn't know anything about the Heavy Vehicle National Law, or stated that they didn't have any practices, she'll be right, I'd strongly suggest that you don't do business with them.
So I think that's going to be one of the really tricky things for a lot of people involved in agriculture, that there's these tight deadlines and these tough set of circumstances we're up against, and often not a lot of transporters in the market. So I guess in those situations where you've got one other option and you've spoken to that transporter and they're not really giving you the assurance that they're across this, that producer's really got to weigh up that risk and then make a business decision as to what they do next.
Yes, that's right, Zach. It's a business decision that hopefully the pushes and pulls in the market with the changes in the law and more people responding positively towards the requirements will hopefully prevent some of circumstances like you explained. But if the comfort's not there and there's some doubt, don't do business with them.
Yep. Okay. So look, another myth we've been hearing about a lot. Farmers need to check a driver's work diary, and in these scenarios, we're presuming that it's a contractor that's coming onto the property to undertake a freight task. Do farmers have to check an operator's work diary?
No, that's a myth, Zach. It's not a requirement to check a driver's work diary. As a matter of fact, there's no authority or power to demand that sort of information from a driver. It doesn't mean that you can't ask, but it's not a requirement. what's important is that the people that the farmers are doing business with are operating legally, lawfully and safely, and that perhaps before they're engaged, that you have some understanding that they understand their responsibilities in relation to fatigue, and that they have a system in place to make sure that offences aren't being committed. If a farmer did notice that perhaps a driver was tired, perhaps it would be a good idea to contact the operator or have a talk to the driver, see if you can provide somewhere for him to rest, or just ask him how he's going. And if there is an issue, by all means try and contact someone who can control the situation or influence, and just make a note of it. But you can only do what you can do.
So in that scenario, let's say a driver comes onto your property, you're there with your hand on the auger, getting ready to load them, and you suspect that they're fatigued. You ask a question, "Are you all right, mate?" You start the conversation. You're not confident with the answer. You go away and possibly call the company. What happens next? How does a producer start to document this so that there's, evidence that they've done what they were meant to do under the new laws?
Well, I would suggest that the law's not definitive of how that needs to be done, but just practical. Like a special record book doesn't necessarily have to be there for when these events occur. I mean, a farmer might only utilise another transporter once a year for one load. So it's probably not important exactly where or how that's done, but as long as there's a record or the information shared and some sort of record of what action was taken, so you can demonstrate later on if you're asked the question, this is what I did.
So the farmer pulling out their notebook and jotting down what took place is a step in the right direction.
Absolutely, but certainly communication with the driver in the circumstance you explain, and the operator if that's possible. And of course, I suppose if there are other people working at the site, share your concerns and get opinion from them how they feel. But once again, it's what you can control and can influence, and you can only do what you can do.
Yeah, and look, probably good to have a quick talk about the other scenario here, which is around a producer using their own trucks and their own staff. So in terms of managing fatigue in that instance, obviously the primary producer would have a lot more control and influence.
Absolutely, and the requirement is that they would be across the requirements for fatigue and mass and dimension, etc., speeding and all of the other fences, that they are like a prominent party in the chain then for those circumstances, whether that's one trip a year or one trip a day. Perhaps some of the systems in place might be different, but it's the same obligations.
Yeah, no worries. So, maintenance records. A farmer's required to check the vehicle's maintenance records?
No, it's not a requirement to check maintenance records, but it's important to only deal with operators that you know or you feel comfortable with that are operating safely and maintaining their vehicles. And like they would be doing business now, I'm sure a farmer doesn't choose to have someone transport his goods with broken down and damaged equipment that might affect his property that's being transported. So it's just a matter of concentrating on the things that they probably do automatically now, and understanding that these relate to an obligation now under the law.
Okay, so I think the next thing, and it's tied to maintenance records, and that's around inspecting vehicles for roadworthiness. Let's discuss that in a bit more detail.
Well, once again, a farmer doesn't have to inspect a heavy vehicle to make sure that it's roadworthy. But obviously, if perhaps they noticed something or something was continually occurring where a vehicle was not being maintained properly, I think it's important to make a record of it and communicate that with the operator, because although it may not be the farmer's responsibility to repair it or take some other action, it is a responsibility that he can influence. So once again, communicate with someone who can make a difference, whether that's the owner of the truck or the driver, and provide an environment where some of these things can be remedied on their property if that's practical.
So obviously going back to one of the previous points we discussed, there's no obligation for a farmer or a primary producer to be present when a vehicle is being loaded. But let's say they are present and the truck rolls up to the cattle yards or rolls up to the silos and the farmer notices that something's clearly amiss. So, there's hydraulic fluid, running out the bottom or something with the truck is awry. What does the farmer do in that instance?
I think, for example, they could have a conversation with the driver and talk about the issue and work together to try and remedy and fix whatever that problem is. Like you said, it's something mechanical. It can either be fixed on the site or not, but the farmer can refuse to continue the loading of his product and once again communicate with the operator that there's a damage or maintenance issue. And I would suggest that if it happened more than once and it was continually happening, that he might have to reconsider who he's doing business with, because obviously an unroadworthy vehicle or unsafe vehicle is something that he doesn't want to work with.
Yeah, and similarly to the previous comment, we would encourage, or you would encourage people to make a note of that discussion or the steps the farmer took in that instance.
I think that's to record. Make a observation, record it down, and report it to those people who can do something about it. Yeah, but that doesn't have to be an onerous or formal process.
Driver's licence, registration, and insurance. I presume I'm noting a theme here. Do farmers need to check off those things?
No, not at all. But in the beginning, when these arrangements are made or contracts are made, it would be important to clear with those operators things such as driver's licence, registration and insurances issues are appropriately managed by the operator, and that they take responsibility for ensure that everything's up to speed and done properly. And if you can't be satisfied that those sort of processes are in place, once again, rethink who you're dealing with.
So driver speed, and I think we touched on this a little earlier, but how does a primary producer deal with driver speeds when they're using contractors? So obviously the contractor comes from a depot or comes from somewhere else onto a farmer's property. The farmer has no visibility of how that takes place, and then for all intents and purposes, once that truck leaves the front gate, the farmer again doesn't have a lot of visibility or coverage as to what the driver of that truck does. So, how does a farmer deal with that?
Well, Zach, in most circumstances, like you've described, a farmer wouldn't have any control or influence over what happens once goods leave their property or directly in relation to speeding. But what's important is that in their negotiations with the transporters, that enough times are made available to load vehicles and drive to its destination legally and safely, and factoring in any unplanned delays or some contingency plans when something might go wrong. And importantly, a farmer shouldn't make any request to put pressure on the drivers to be somewhere at a certain time, or if you're not here, this is going to happen. That's making a demand of a driver, which is influencing an offence to be committed. And I'm sure a farmer understands how to manage that properly.
So we got a question that came through prior to the webinar on curfews. So often in the cattle sector, sale yards, processing plants, ports have curfews, and I don't have the question in front of me, but the way it was worded was around all the best preparation went in place, and you have to meet a curfew. And from the driver's point of view, everything happens as it should, but with animals and machinery, things go pear-shaped, putting pressure on drivers to be there by a certain time. How do we manage stuff like that? You've got a 6 p.m. deadline, and everything goes wrong, and ultimately, from the primary producer perspective, we need to get those cattle on the boat, or we need to get those cattle into the sale yard.
Yes, I understand, and it's probably quite a common issue for farmers and how to manage it. But I would suggest that in your planning and the arrangements that you make, communication is important to step through a worst-case scenario of your operational procedure of transporting your goods, make some allowances, have some contingency plans, and communicate to other parties in the chain that you're involved with what the options are if something goes wrong, what solutions are, and how they'll be managed. And also, perhaps it's important to highlight that in any contractual arrangements right from the beginning of what the consequences are when something goes wrong. But ultimately, be assured not to make any demands or influence a driver, for example. I don't care what you do, get there by this time, because that's unlawful.
Yeah. Okay, so take-home message there that under these new laws, and I assume actually under the existing laws, anyone in the chain cannot direct another party in the chain to knowingly break the law. So
that's correct. That's unlawful in itself. Yeah.
Yes. So steer clear of giving those directives, and I guess the other thing you're saying there is think about contingency planning and what prior steps you can take to actually ensure that the things don't go pear-shaped to start with, and then I guess as things do start to go pear-shaped, it's really about communication and talking to those other parties to mitigate the risks and come up with a way to facilitate the transport task safely. Absolutely.
Ideally, eliminate these issues or minimise risks such as safety to the best that you possibly can, but communicate early. Don't leave it until the driver arrives or after they've left even. Communicate beforehand. If you're going to be late with your gear being picked up, have a plan in place when this does go wrong and communicate as early as you can so the other parties can do what they can to help meet their obligations.
Okay, thank you. And I'm just noticing some good questions coming through on mass, so we'll address those in a second because we're about to get there. But before we do, permits. So a farmer or a primary producer needs to make sure that the transporter they're using has the necessary permits to get from their property to the destination. How do we deal with that type of thing, Steve?
Well, if it's the farmer themselves with their gear and their vehicle, the responsibility is them to obtain the appropriate permits. But otherwise, prior to making any movements, they need to be ensured by the transporter that they've obtained all the permits and requirements that's necessary.
Yeah, and I just on that, and I know, Steve, you don't look after access, that you're in a regulatory compliance role, and in Queensland it's a little bit complicated at the moment because Transport and Main Roads still plays a role, has a delegated authority from the NHVR, but I guess making sure producers know they can jump onto the NHVR customer access portal and start the process of creating permits and getting the necessary approvals from, whether it's a road train permit, whether it's an oversized over mass permit, you can go to that NHVR portal.
Yeah, it's something that's been introduced and it's new and helpful to those people who need to obtain their permits. But just on that, even if a farmer is relying on his transporter to obtain the permits, it doesn't hurt to be across some of the information and requirements so they can feel confident that everything's been done correctly.
Yeah. So farmers need to be there when the vehicle is loaded. We've spoken about this. Before, so we can probably skip over that. But just to summarise, they don't need to be present when a vehicle's loaded, providing the contractor has knowledge of where they need to go, safe access, that the goods are ready to be loaded, that there aren't things there, that potentially cause issues for the transporter. But the farmer or primary producer doesn't need to be physically present.
Doesn't have to be physically there. Obviously, if they can be, it's a positive step. They need to be across the planning and be involved in the process, but no, they don't have to be there.
So this is probably a really key one and not necessarily simple, especially in the grain sector. Farmers need to know how much their produce weighs.
Yeah, that's correct. They should be able to advise the transporter to some degree of accuracy what the mass of their product is, whether that's something that they weigh themselves or use some other method to be as accurate as possible, so that then the transporter can make the right decision about what sort of vehicle and how he operates in transport. It's part of their responsibility, and as we said before, the shared responsibilities, that's the part the farmer would play. So it's important that you find out what and also take into account, humidity and things like that, of course, as they would know about what a range is. So there's probably, it's very important to make allowances, both positive and negative, in relation to those weights, etc.
Yeah, so I guess going back to the previous comment about not needing to be present, a farmer is using a contractor, the contractor comes to his silos and loads the truck with say, wheat. The farmer isn't present for the loading of that. What control and influence do they have over the mass? Or in that instance, does the mass, does the responsibility for the mass sit entirely with that transporter?
I would suggest that the farmer needs to be across the transporter's processes and have an understanding that the correct vehicles are being used and be informed enough and comfortable that they are meeting their obligations, and if they are made aware of issues or that there is an issue, that they inform those people who can influence or control it. Not, neglect that part of the process. They need to be comfortable that trucks aren't over mass or overloaded, etc.
Okay, so still the same scenario. We've got a contractor coming onto a grain property to load grain, yet the farmer is there, and he's the one that's starting the auger, and he's the one that's putting the grain in the back of the truck. In that scenario, I guess, how do we break down the responsibility between the driver or the transporter and the farmer that's actually there physically helping with the loading?
Well, technically, I imagine that would be covered in the original arrangement or contractual of whose responsibility is what, and I encourage farmers to make sure that they're clear in what those responsibilities are. If a farmer is loading, he is a party to in the COR, so he has to take responsibility for that loading, so he needs to be across the vehicle, what its capacity is and how it's to be appropriately loaded as well as restrained, and communicate with the driver and work together on making sure that it's done safely as well as as required.
And thankfully, to give AgForce a plug, thankfully here in Queensland, we help manage the Grain Harvest Management Scheme, which if you're a registered truck and you're loading on farm, you can get a 7.5% tolerance on your gross vehicle mass, which certainly gives primary producers comfort that there is that buffer when loading grain without having a registered weighbridge to drive over. Although there's obviously a lot of trucks that still move grain around Queensland that aren't under the Grain Harvest Management Scheme, and obviously then they're working with the mass limit, whether it's HML, whether it's GML, PBS. They obviously have to stick to that, and there's no tolerance at all.
No, well, just on that, another thing I was thinking of there is that when a prime producer is considering who's going to transport his grain, for example, and he has some concerns, it probably wouldn't hurt to choose someone who has onboard scales, for example, so then you can accurately weigh at the time, can't you?
Yep.
That would be a good decision, the best decision.
Yep. Okay.
Or a better decision.
And also another tricky thing, and I guess with the amount of hay and silage being transported across Australia right now, it's probably quite topical, load restraint. Farmers need to make sure that the load is restrained. And again, I guess in this scenario we're talking about a transporter that's coming on farm.
Yeah, well, it's important to identify whose responsibility it is right from the start and have an understanding. If the farmer's loading his property, his produce onto his truck, obviously it's entirely his responsibility. However, using a subcontractor, the responsibility at the request of the farmer might be that the driver loads, for example. but make sure that's clear and there's an understanding. And obviously use common sense that if you notice something that is not right, speak up.
Yeah. Very good. So
in summary, just to make a point of the most significant or the most important relevant areas of responsibility for a farmer is to make sure that what the mass is loaded onto a vehicle, and importantly how it's distributed on the truck. If you can be sure of that. Try and make sure that you have as much information as possible to ensure that the vehicle is fit for its purpose. If it's not the right vehicle and you sense there's a problem, contact the operator and don't load it. If you notice that a driver's tired or it's a concern, make a note of it, have a discussion with them, ring the operator if it's possible. And when you're loading and packing goods, make sure that it's done appropriately and safely, and you share as much information about your load as possible to make sure that the driver or the loader can accurately and appropriately meet their obligations, and really avoid making any requests or demands on drivers, for example, or other parties in the chain that could influence them to speed or otherwise act unlawfully.
So I guess take-home messages and the real key theme throughout your presentation, Steve, around communication.
Yeah, I think it's, and I understand that a lot of the audience have been doing business with some of these operators for a long time, and there's an understanding and a history of how things are done, but it's probably just important, like we mentioned earlier, just to revisit your arrangements, make sure that everyone's across what their obligations are, and that there's a clear understanding of what is required to be done to operate safely in relation to the transport.
And next thing to recap and make crystal clear, I guess that reporting process or what the primary producer does after there is a questionable instance or if there's something that happens on farm that concerns them, simply recording that with as much detail as possible so that under worst case scenario they can outline what they did to meet their responsibilities.
I think you've described that pretty good, Zach. Yeah, just that you're able to demonstrate to someone, if you're asked the question, what were the circumstances, what happened, and that you can retrieve that information readily if appropriate.
So if you're a primary producer and you've been paying attention to these sort of things and workplace health and safety laws and other things over the last few years, come 1st of October, that there's a fair likelihood that you're already doing what's required under these new chain of responsibility laws.
Yes, it's likely that farmers are already conducting a lot of the requirements and activities to meet their obligations, but just haven't formalised it or haven't documented it or perhaps even reviewed it for a while. So what you said is exactly right, but it's probably a good time just to make sure that there's some communication up and down the entire chain and everyone understands where they sit and what the responses will be if something goes wrong, what the remedies will be if we need to fix something, and so that everyone in the chain feels much more informed than perhaps they have in the past when it's created a little bit of uncertainty.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing taking out of today and to reassure farmers that you don't need a 150-page policy and procedure manual that maps out every possible scenario under the sun, that legislation like this isn't prescriptive. It actually gives the flexibility for individuals to have a look at their own enterprise and make common sense decisions around how they manage the risks.
Yeah. It's the documentation, etc., required to make sure that you meet your obligation is obviously going to be different for someone who has one transaction with with one vehicle one day a year, as opposed to an organisation with 100 vehicles doing 100 transactions a day. But it's basically just having replicating the way you do business in a documented form. So there's an understanding that if the question's asked, you can demonstrate this is how we do business.
So obviously, 1st of October is just around the corner. Where can people go for more information on these changes? And where can they go to sort of, I guess, start to develop a system or start to put some things in place? Well, where do people go for that?
Well, I encourage. There's a lot of information on our website. I encourage farmers to go to the NHVR website and look at chain of responsibility. There's some templates there that they can use that describes about conducting business with a third party, which is important, and also the responsibilities as each party in the chain. You can also ring the NHVR if you've got any queries, and of course through you, you can pass on any queries to me, and we'll get back and help as swiftly as we can.
So to follow up on that, AgForce is obviously working with Transport and Main Roads and NHVR and other parties like that all the time to ensure that I guess these systems are appropriate for primary producers, and that we don't end up with burdensome red tape, which I know is the bane of primary producers' existence. So I'd encourage anyone to get on the phone to AgForce, and Amelia and I can work through your issues, and we can pass those on to the NHVR. And I'd also like to say that the National Farmers Federation and other national players in the agriculture space are also doing stuff to ensure that primary producers have what they need. So if you've got questions and queries, feel free to get in touch with the NHVR directly, but we'd also love to get your questions and queries as well, because then we know what you're thinking and we can, I guess, better advocate on your behalf. I think we've addressed the questions that have come through as we've gone through the presentation, but if there's anything else, NHVR has kindly offered to respond to questions afterwards, and we can provide those back to the membership. So if you're cogitating on what you've heard today as you're lying in bed tonight, feel free to shoot through any questions, give us a call, and we can pass that on and get you an answer back as soon as possible, because the 1st of October is just around the corner. But I think my take-home message from today is that the world isn't changing on the 1st of October, and that so much of this is common sense, and from the conversations I've had with a lot of producers, so much of this is already happening on a day-to-day basis. Any last messages you want to add, Steve, before we sign off?
Well, just one other thing, Zach, I just thought of that on our website. I asked about where further information could be obtained. We have a gap assessment tool, and it's on our website where if there's any farmers there who are still concerned, or there's questions or issues about, well, I still don't understand, or where are the gaps, or what's wrong with my system, you can actually enter a series of questions, and as a various party in the chain, and in response to the information that's provided, it's confidential, information's not used. You can actually generate then a number of responses that are suggestions and recommendations to help make your system appropriate for the activities that you conduct. It's called the Gap Assessment Tool. I recommend that, particularly for those people who perhaps are still concerned and aren't sure about their system.
Yeah. Fantastic. Amelia, anything from your perspective?
No, just that a recording of this will be made available to those of you who are currently on the line, and also those that are registered, and those that have just dialed in via the phone. And as Zach said, if anyone does have any further questions, feel free to contact AgForce and NHVR. But other than that, I think most of our questions have been covered. And
I guess just finally to give a plug, please give us feedback on things like this. Is it a good way to get information to you? And are there other topics that you'd like us to cover? We're based in Brisbane, and we've got access to a lot of experts. And if this is a good way to get those experts to you on topics that we work on, you let us know and we'll try to facilitate so we can get you the information you need. It's often a lot cheaper than either getting people from Brisbane to you or getting you to Brisbane. So feel free to let us know any ideas.
Wonderful. Well, as I mentioned, a email will go out after this with this copy of the presentation. Should you have any further questions, feel free to email myself or Zach. Those details will be in that email. And I hope you all enjoy your day. Thank you.